Naloxone, also known as Narcan or Eviso. What is naloxone? It's an opioid antagonist used to reverse the effects of an opioid overdose, allowing for breathing to become regulated. Opioids are drugs that bind to one or more of the 3 opioid receptors in the human body. Examples of opioids are HYDROCODONE. It is one of the most frequently prescribed opioid painkillers and also the most abused. OXYCODONE is also another one. It's less frequently abused, yet highly addictive. Another example of an opioid is heroin. Symptoms of an opioid overdose include slow to no breathing, small or pinpoint pupils, extreme drowsiness, or slow heartbeat. How is naloxone used? It's either injected under the skin or into the muscle, or using an IV with the brand name Eviso. It's also used using a nasal syringe with the brand name Narcan. Naloxone side effects are due to the reversal of opioid effects that can lead to sudden withdrawal symptoms such as nausea, fever, sweating, tremors, and body aches. Applications in the real world include for ERs, hospital inpatients, by paramedics, at home, by caregivers or family members. Naloxone can also be combined with oxycodone to reduce opioid side effects and risk of addiction. We are currently in an opioid epidemic. Americans consume more opioids than any other country. In 2016 alone, 11.5 million people misused prescription opioids, and 17,087 deaths were attributed to overdosing on common prescription opioids. Overdose deaths involving opioids have increased from 2000 to 2016. Other synthetic opioids have increased the most, with heroin and natural and semi-synthetic opioids increasing as well, with the exception of methadone.
Naloxone, or naloxone. Naloxone is a non-selective competitive opioid inhibitor that is capable of blocking and reversing the effects of opioid drugs, including in the case of overdose. These effects occur approximately after 2 minutes when administered intravenously and about 5 minutes when administered intramuscularly. But how does this all work? As mentioned before, naloxone is a non-selective competitive inhibitor. This means that it actively competes with the opioids that are already in the body for receptor sites. As you can see here, naloxone bears a striking resemblance to oxymorphone, a morphine derivative that's 10 times more potent than morphine, which is reflective of its stronger ability to bind to the opioid receptors that are responsible for its activity. As expected, this strong ability to bind to opioid receptors is carried over to naloxone. However, as highlighted here, naloxone differs from oxymorphone by the addition of this double bonded carbon group, known as an allyl group. In simple terms, a drug must satisfy 2 requirements in order to have biological activity. First, it must have the proper shape and electronic properties to bind to the receptor. Secondly, it must also interact with the receptor enough to activate it. This mechanism is typically modulated through activator and deactivator regions. N-phenethylmorphine is an example of a morphine derivative that solely interacts with the activator regions within the receptor site. As you can see here, the phenethyl group is too bulky to properly interact with the deactivator region, yet it is the perfect length and size to effectively interact with the activator region. As such, it is known as a pure agonist. As noted before, naloxone possesses an identical skeleton to oxymorphone. However, the N-allyl group is too short to interact with the region that is responsible for activation, but the tethered allyl group is the right length and the right size to interact with the secondary deactivator region. As such, it is what is known as an antagonist or an inhibitor. This is a visual representation of what competitive inhibition looks like at the cellular level. Opioid receptors belong to the GPCR class of receptors. When a drug molecule, in this case morphine, binds to a receptor on the surface of the cell, A signal is sent which promotes activity within the cell. As a competitive inhibitor, naloxone is able to fit into the receptor and prevent other drug molecules from binding, thereby reversing the effects of the drugs and preventing the effects from getting worse in the case of overdose. You can think of it this way. The axle of the skateboard is the receptor, and the wheel is a drug molecule. Once bound, the drug receptor complex is able to promote its activity and roll away. However, if we were to bind an inhibitor to the receptor, in this case the square wheel, we can effectively disable the activity of the enzyme, and the board is unable to roll.
There are limits to our skateboard analogy. Don't get me wrong, naloxone is indeed a good drug that almost immediately puts a stop to an opioid overdose, but we mustn't forget the root of the problem. The patients saved by naloxone are still addicted to opioids. Let's use duct tape as another analogy. Duct tape can fix up your broken water pipe, mend your broken table leg, and shush the child you just kidnapped. It's a ubiquitous solution to your everyday needs. However, given some time, the child's cry will be released with all fury, the table will fail you, and the water pipe will flood your house. In the end, just like duct tape, naloxone is a short-term solution. A person overdosing on opioids can be saved with a dose of naloxone and regain some vigor in their life. But it won't be long until they reach for more opioids, whether by prescription or an unregulated source. This cycle could repeat 1, 2, 3, 4, or more times. If one of those times naloxone isn't on hand, the duct tape will peel off and the house will flood. Still, the value of naloxone cannot be undermined. A study published in the Lancet Public Health Journal on April 17th of this year investigated the impact of take-home naloxone kits in Canada's opioid crisis. This graph summarizes their data. It charts the number of deaths caused by fentanyl, a synthetic opioid, year by year. Similar to the US, we see a steady increase in deaths from 2012 to approaching 2016. Where we see a rapid rise in deaths. Following increased distribution of take-home naloxone kits, we see a corresponding decline in deaths. The study estimates that a total of 298 lives were saved. An additional 118 could have been saved had naloxone been heavily distributed before 2016. Based on this modeling study, making naloxone widely available to the vulnerable would definitely have a positive impact. Naloxone is a short-term solution. It doesn't magically cure you of addiction as well. What it does do, though, is give you a second chance, so that if you or your loved one ever find yourselves in the clutches of opioid addiction, you will have that chance to fight back, little by little.
Thank you for watching. Naloxone can be found at most CVS and Walgreens stores.